Hey, welcome back for another episode of Red Letter Disciple. We got a great guest, a returning guest coming on today. His name's Bryan Stecker. Super excited that you are listening in on these conversations. We are excited about the future of the LCMS and creating more great disciples of Jesus. Bryan is the host of the On the Line podcast and coming out with something new called Memento 70. And it's here in 2026 going to be a brand new opportunity for men to practice discipleship with other men. It's online. It's a beautiful thing to create some really great habits. As people are thinking about creating habits in the new year, why not do that with other men in the LCMS? And so thank you, Bryan, for your leadership, your innovation. It's changing lives. And today's episode is brought to you by Red Letter Living. We've got this awesome resource we just came out with this fall called Giving Challenge. It's a 40-day generosity challenge to lead your people to be more generous like Jesus has been generous for you and I. Churches that went through it in the first wave saw incredible results. Offerings increased, individuals upping their generosity habits, one-time sacrificial gifts that were just unbelievable, and then daily small opportunities of generosity that would come from it. If you'd like more information, please go to redlettergiving.com. New Year and Lent are a fabulous time to kick off a 40-day challenge. Why not one that grows disciples and grows the funds for the vision of your church to get met? We'd love to link in with you. You can go to redlettergiving.com to find out more information. But without further ado, let's get to today's episode with Bryan Stecker. Let's do this. All right, we have a returning guest to the Red Letter Disciple because he's got some big news coming up on things he's been working on, and we're going to get to that in just a moment. But I want to welcome Bryan Stecker back onto the Red Letter Disciple. So Bryan, hey man, for those that didn't catch your last appearance, give us the quick version, catch us up on who you are and what's your heart for discipleship and what's been going on in your life.
Yes, I'm an associate pastor here in Waconia, Minnesota at Trinity Lutheran Church and School, which is great. It's a wonderful church, great team here. Pastor Duncan's the senior pastor, just great guy. Probably most kind of notably, or maybe like the angle that discipleship's taken for me personally has to do with, something that you share, right? Has to do with digital media, really basing off of the passion that, if you take the average 23 to 33-year-old, which they're flocking to the church right now, which is awesome, right? They're flocking to Christianity for the first time in living memory. But what's that path going to look like? If you take a 23-year-old in the suburbs of Chicago, they went to church periodically as a young kid, then stopped going for over a decade. They hear Jordan Peterson talking about the Bible, and they're like, oh, maybe there's more to the Bible than I thought, than I got in Sunday school, in my distant memory. What are they going to do? Well, they're not just going to go to the closest church down the street and learn about it there first. Hopefully they go there eventually, and many of them are. But first, they're going to go online, and they're going to look for people that can teach them more about this. So they're going to go to YouTube. They might go to social media, but they'll more formally go to YouTube or podcasts. And when you go there and you look at resources, the Lutheran Church is drastically behind. I've run numbers, and I think a pretty conservative guess, if you were to simplify it and just say, if you take the Roman Catholic Church and us, they probably have about a 2,000 to 1 digital footprint, which means what are they most likely going to come across if they don't have like a grandma that was Lutheran and therefore like Lutherans bobbling around in their brain, so they're looking for a Lutheran resource. They're just going to come across Catholic, let alone the Orthodox and the Evangelical. And if they end up going to church like so many of these young people are, 10 months later, which church are they going to? Well, they're probably, they're probably going to the Catholic Mass. So that's really kind of my passion, because there's a lot of things that need to be done in the church, of course, and specifically local churches. But I think that's an area where if we want to reach young people, this is an area that we want to get better at. We don't want a 2,000 to 1 ratio. Population size Catholics to Lutherans are about 70 to 1. So we want to get closer to that 70 to 1 number. And I know you're working on that as well, so that we can bring more people into the Lutheran Church and let them know what kind of theology we have, what we think, what we hold to be true, understand the gospel more truly. So that's certainly the angle that I have with both On the Line, the podcast, Lutheran Institute of Theology, and then, Memento, which we might talk about later.
We will. We'll definitely talk about it. But yeah, what do you, from a sense of, I feel like there's a lot of people that maybe aren't as forward thinking or kind of even anti using social media, which YouTube is one. TikTok. What are kind of your pushbacks to that for those that are like, I don't think we need to be involved in the digital game? How would you respond to that?
Yeah, and I mean with that personally, I don't use social media, so I can relate to that, in certainly big ways. But I think the church throughout its history has been, Jesus. There's multiple parables where he's talking about being shrewd, right? Use the faculties that God has given you. The printing press is obviously a great example in Lutheran history of just kind of being able to take advantage of a technology. And are there negatives to the printing press? Certainly you can point to a lot of negatives. Can you point to negatives of social media? Absolutely. We really don't even actually engage on that front, but I think that's something that people should do. So you always have to be careful with those things personally because they can be, personally harmful. But that is how people engage, and there's a great opportunity for that. One of the ways I explain it to people in our church that are like over 50 or over 60, because they don't understand what the podcast realm is even. I'm like, okay, when you grew up, you probably watched Fox News or CNN, and that was like the news. And if you went to the barbershop or you went to the bar or you went to get coffee, like everyone kind of knew what happened on the 5 o'clock news. Like that was the narrative that kind of formed conversation socially. Well, not that long ago, maybe the last 15 years, that's fractured. To where now people don't go to CNN and Fox News, they go to podcasts in droves more than that. I think if you take any of the big name podcasts, they're getting 10 to 20 to 50x what CNN gets on a night. So that it's been decentralized, but it's been decentralized in ways that people now can go to like Christian podcasts and learn about different things. So that's the lay of the land, is that people always engage in news and information. We've done it for a long time. It's taken on a different framework today. I think the comment section is probably its own issues, when it comes to media and podcasts. But I think leaning into that and just finding a way to bring the gospel into different people's lives, this is a great opportunity that we should lean into.
That's really cool. I hadn't heard the 2,000 to 1. Is that from your own study, or is that how did you get to that number? Because I think that's something that collectively, and again, not everybody will be able to do as much as you are, as much as I am attempting to do potentially. But how'd you get to that number? Or tell me more about that.
Yeah, so that's my own research and a pretty good effort in there. I'd be
Sure.
shocked if I'm way off. I think the range I came down to was between 1 and 5,000, and it kind of depends on what you call a digital media footprint. But a good example of this would be there are over 100 Catholic channels that have over 100,000 subscribers. And many of those, I mean, Bishop Barron's got over 1 million, Pints with Aquinas, Matt Fradd, who just, by the way, moved to Daily Wire, which is going to amplify his audience even more. But before that, he had 775,000. So if you go to the Lutherans, for example, you have 0 over 100,000. You've got Brian Wolfmueller, don't directly quote me, but I think he's around 50,000. You've got Jordan Cooper. He's not LCMS, but I'm thinking in Communion Fellowship, and he's around somewhere between 60 and 80. Or around 25,000. So you can see just going off of that, there's a massive difference. If you zoom into the views that go there, that's big too. And then if you go to the podcast sphere, that's going to, those that don't use YouTube, those numbers are going to ripple there. Then you have things like Word on Fire Media or the St. Paul Institute, which are what we're trying to do for Lutheran Institute of Theology, but they're 25 years ahead of us. They've just got mass productions. They're reaching millions upon millions of people just with Word on Fire every year. So that's where when you get those numbers, you look and it's like, you're probably at least 2,000 to 1.
Yeah, and we've got a lot of pastors that create a lot of content. We've also got a number of great young folks in our church body that may grow up and be the people that do the podcasts and do the media that become so influential and maybe get us to some of those numbers where we've got channels over 100,000 or more. What would you say from you personally, whether you're like a longtime listener, faithful of them, or just a learner, what are 3 to 5 podcasts that you're really paying attention to right now? Can be secular, spiritual, whatever. And then with those, what is it particularly the angle that you're grabbing from it and learning from?
Yeah, so this is not like, I'm not advocating here for other Lutheran podcasts. Is that correct? Like I'm just saying,
it can be any podcast. Yeah.
Yeah. Take some of these with a grain of salt. I listen to Joe Rogan, and I mean, it's PG-13R. He's not. I mean, he's from Boston.
Yeah.
He's not a Christian. Reason I listen to him is one, I mean, he's the GOAT. He's number one by far. So there's a little bit of just trying to learn about what he does. But I think he's also a litmus on what your normal, what the normal person that you see at the brewery, what are they thinking? So if you want to understand like just the normal people around you, specifically guys, that's going to be the much heavier audience for Joe Rogan. But he very much represents what they're thinking and what kind of questions they're asking in conversation. So it helps me understand normal people that I'm going to engage in my community. Jordan Peterson's another good example where he's an example of someone who's I think a very thorough and thoughtful thinker who is wrestling with Christianity in the same way C.S. Lewis did when he came into Christianity from the outside. Lewis came in a very intellectual way. It took arguments and a lot of thought to bring him in. Jordan Peterson's that way. I actually might suspect that he's actually a member of the Catholic Church now. He hasn't said that publicly, but I suspect he might have even made that jump. But either way, there's another litmus of someone who's not going to speak, confessionally from a Lutheran, even like creedally, like he's not going to speak, correctly in that way. But that's a good example of someone who's looking at Christianity thoughtfully from the outside. So those are two good examples. What else do I listen to that I would recommend outside? I mean, I'll listen to Catholic ones to like try to understand where they're coming from and how they articulate things and whatnot. Matt Fradd, Pints with Aquinas, or Bishop Barron are probably the two best there.
That's cool. And what's kind of neat, even on the Joe Rogan side too, is I haven't listened to too much of his stuff, but from what it does sound like, it sounds like he's kind of on a spiritual journey himself and is a lot more pro-Jesus than maybe he was or people thought a few years ago. My wife listens to Andrew Huberman, the Huberman Lab podcast.
That's great, yeah.
Pretty regularly, and I think he's on that same spiritual journey where it's in its infancy, but he's saying some pretty interesting, cool things about the power of prayer and the healing effect of Jesus. And so it's kind of neat to see these prominent figures, albeit doing it in very different ways and sometimes very colorful ways, kind of landing in this place. And I think that I wonder with me a little bit, maybe you've looked at this more, but I wonder how much of that is not impacting that, like you said, 23 to 33-year-old age range that's kind of like, it feels like coming back to church and or thinking Jesus is cool again. Is there a direct tie-in, or what do you think about that?
I definitely think so. There's something potent about somebody who you can know for a period of time and you respect, and obviously his listeners very much, respect his thoughts, and to watch them, even at this point, like even if he stops at this point, even just his opening up, when he brings on someone like Wesley Huff, who, who's an evangelical apologist.
I did listen to that one. Yeah.
That was great,
Yeah.
And I mean, I thought Wesley Huff handled that really good. And then he goes on, what's the other one? The Flagrant podcast. It's like a comedic type podcast, but they just drilled him with questions for like 2.5, 3 hours. And he just handled it. Like those give a lot of credence to Christianity. For people that are wrestling with that. So I think that's, and I mean, there was one I listened to with Duncan Trussell who was on, and I think Duncan Trussell is kind of like a friend of Joe Rogan's. They're two comedians, but this guy's been going to Catholic Mass on and off for about 6 months. And there were some times where he was nailing it right. I mean, he was speaking very, poetically and very intellectually on Christian thought. There were other times where he was just, it was just bold heresy of things he was saying, right? But it's just, it is helpful to watch people wrestle, because I think, at least for like you and I, like our profession is in the church. So sometimes we're just always thinking within, like our theological confessional bubble, and sometimes it's tough to like understand, like, what's this 25-year-old, what are these questions he's asking? Where are they coming from? And it is very helpful to know what they're thinking, what they're hearing, and how that's informing their thoughts. So you can just kind of lightly try to guide them from there.
That's cool. So yeah, let's talk about discipleship. It's a passion that both of us have. This is a discipleship podcast, wanting to challenge all of us to be greater disciples of Jesus. Specifically, looking at our own church body, the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, for quite some time now in these conversations. But what are you kind of seeing across the LCMS discipleship landscape, if you will, happening right now in our world?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, there's two ways to look at it. There's the local church, which is tougher for me to tap into. Same with you. I can tell you what's going on at Trinity, and you can tell me what's going on in Omaha. But it's tough to know. I think we just had Heath Curtis on recently. Yeah, you should have Heath Curtis on. I think you guys would have a
And
great.
he's the Southern Illinois district
Yes.
president. Is that right? Yep.
hmm and he brought up a good point, which I've been kind of wrestling with recently, which is that there's a like a potency to culture and to ethos.
Mm-hmm.
So for instance, oh goodness, I'm drawing a blank on his name, not George McDonald. G.K. Chesterton talks about this, where he says the last thing to die in like a Christian culture is its habits and its customs, and we see this every Christmas, right? Where a whole bunch of people come in on Christmas Eve, and they're not thinking like, oh, I haven't come in 6 months, I feel really guilty. They're thinking like, this is what we do at Christmas. Like, we go to church, like we celebrate the birth of Jesus, and they might not think about it for another 6 months, but that's still like a habit and a custom. People will still pray before at least big family dinners, right? Long after they stop going to church. Like, these are habits and customs. So I think part of discipleship, I think, has to do with habits and just developing good habits, because those things stick. You might wrestle, you might have doubts at times. Your intellectual focus will go here and there, but if you can generate those kind of habits, those things stick with you. You can think about someone that they can't imagine waking up on Tuesday and not going to the gym. I can imagine that right now with our 4 young kids, I'm not as good as I used to be. But once we can get our sleep schedule down, like that used to be me, right? It's like I can't imagine not waking up, because it just becomes a habit. It becomes instinctual. So I think anything in the church that creates those habits, and there's a lot of different ways to do that. Obviously, the divine service is going to be a cornerstone there, but just being like, hey, it doesn't need to be a long prayer in the morning, but maybe good advice is just before you look at anything else on your phone, just at least say the Our Father. Or maybe read a paragraph in the book of John, or whatever it is that you're reading. Like, just start there with those little habits, and I think that holds a lot of weight.
Yeah, that's good. I was kind of, when I was working on my second book, which was Being Challenge, all about how to be in a relationship with God, how do we grow? That was kind of where I landed, was like, let's look at Jesus. He's the only one that's ever been in a perfect relationship with God. And so rather than like looking at someone else, like, he's the one we should look at, and let's look at what habits did he have in his life. We use the word spiritual disciplines a lot in the church, but I kind of use the word habits quite a bit. We call them keystone habits. But I was convicted. Duke University did a study that said that 40%, almost half of what we do, of our daily actions, are not actually things that we do or think about. They're just habits that we're on autopilot essentially for about half of what we do. And I wonder how much time as pastor, you can answer for yourself, like, or that you've seen in other pastors. Do we spend too much time trying to like help people make the right decisions, and not enough time in helping them form the right habits that will automatically help them make the right decisions? Does that make sense?
Yes, yeah. I think that's spot on, especially when it comes to one of the advice I now give to couples when I do premarital counseling is, I'm like, you should seriously consider doing marriage counseling in your life.
Yeah.
Because what you find is usually usually things, they're like, they come in and they're like, Pastor, I think we're thinking of a divorce. You're like, hold up, like, where did this come from? It's like, well, about 3 years ago. And it's like, okay, 3 years ago, like, that's the time. Like, there's no shame. And like, maybe it's meeting with your pastor, maybe it's going to someone else, right? So in other words, the habits have died long before we start to deal with like the intellectual conversation, or trying to find like an answer to this problem that we're addressing. So I do think that daily habits are such a key. It could be it could be in relational things like marriage or parenting, and it could just be in personal practices and spiritual disciplines and such. But yeah, if you can nail down the habits, you will avoid a lot of icebergs that are out there.
Yeah. So, yeah, let's talk about that then, especially when it comes to your heart for discipling men. I've got 2 boys that are 18 and 14, a senior and a freshman. And so, that this is high on my list right now of how do I form these really young men into even greater young men right now. And what's kind of neat, we mentioned already a couple times that younger generation is kind of trending back towards some good faith metrics, and it's actually being led by the men, which has been that's a reversal of what it's been in the past. And so, hopefully one day we'll get men and women at the same time. Lord, let it be. But at least let's, there's some positivity there. And so, what are the challenges specifically that you're seeing right now when it comes to men and how men are discipled?
Yeah, there's certainly a lot to say there. I think one is, and this is maybe it's being a little bit, the trends are reversing a little bit as you mentioned here, but there was kind of like an effeminization in the church that took place over, I mean, all these things are slow moving, right? So call it 40 years or 50 years or whatever. And I think even in the early 2000s, who was it that wrote Wild at Heart? Eldred, is that his name?
Eldridge, yep.
Yeah. I think he kind of identified that, 15, 20 years ago or so. And it was just that, we focus more, or we can focus more in the church on the emotional side, which is there for sure, right? So it's not, these things aren't in competition. But you can lose some of the aspect of like a calling and a challenge, pick up your cross and follow me, these kind of motifs and themes. And there's certain things that speak to the feminine heart and certain things that speak to the masculine heart. And the gospel is going to certainly cover all of that, but there's certain elements that you can draw out. And so I think that for a while at least, men were not primarily focused in the way that things were articulated within the church, and that's not across the board everywhere. That's just kind of a theme or a data point. So that's one aspect, and it was really beyond the church. I mean, it was just kind of culturally speaking that was kind of the case. And then you saw a rise of a return to this, which always happens, right? There's a vacuum, and then things start to fill its place. A lot of those were healthy, some of those were not. Someone like Andrew Tate is an example of an unhealthy example, but the reason he's got a big following is because he's identifying those issues, and he's
talk to me a little, like, it's and you might be going here, but what is who is Andrew Tate, or what has he been doing that's been unhealthy?
Yeah, I don't know his whole story, but I mean, if you want to talk about the word toxic masculinity, which has been wrongly applied, it's rightly applied to him. It's this idea of he's very proud of, like, I get as many women as I can. I think he's got kids with a bunch of different women, and he's like, it's just like this idea of like, I'm going to be me, and I'm going to be in charge, and I'm going to make a lot of money, and I'm going to be, fit and good looking. So it's just like this, like, I mean, it's toxic, right? Yeah. But people look at that and they go, oh, he's strong, he's bold, he doesn't mince his words, he's speaking about the importance of men. So like, that vacuum it draws them over into this. Then you have ones that are healthy, but they're just not Christian. Someone like Jocko Willink, Joe Rogan would fall into this as well. David Goggins, right? These are guys that they're not Christian, they're not overly toxic, but they're big on self-mastery. Jordan Peterson's another good example. His 12 Rules for Life. He's basically saying, you guys are being slothful. You're not working hard. You're eating potato chips and playing video games. How about you do something productive? And then he walks you through that, and like, men are flocking to that in droves because they haven't heard those narratives for a little while. That pressure, that kind of boldness, almost like going to boot camp and getting beat up a little bit. Like, guys crave that, so they're receiving that there, and they're flocking towards that. And I think the big answer is that the church has a strong tradition of being able to speak to these types of things, but attaching it to a Christian faith. I think one of the slogans we have is, what is it? Devotion without discipline is sentiment, and discipline without devotion leads to pride. So in other words, if you're all about discipline and whatnot, but it's not attached to devotion to Christ and the humility that comes with that, then it's going to lead to pride. Like, I can do anything. I can wake up at 4 and I can run my miles. I can go get this girl if I want. Whatever it is, it's going to become prideful. But then also, if we just have like just devotion, but we don't discipline ourselves and turn it into habits and sometimes make tough decisions to go do the right thing versus the easy thing, then it just becomes sentiment. Then it's a lot of ideas that you look back and you're like, in the last 3 years, I had all these ideas and I never did these things. I talked about, whatever it is, losing weight or doing my prayer life in the morning, but I never like got someone to say, hey, did you do it today? No, like, better do it tomorrow. Like, I didn't have that discipline attached, so it just became a nice sentiment.
Yeah, that's good. I like that, and I think I've seen that definitely, in some people that I know, and then and I can see that in myself too, in different times as well, of where I am disciplined, but I've lost my devotion, and I quickly can get burnt out and do things for the wrong reasons. I've actually found most of the time, though, like, typically the more disciplined I am in one area, I talk about habits, especially physical, the more disciplined I am in my physical habits, typically the stronger I am in my spiritual habits. Have you noticed anything with that in yourself or with other men that you've discipled?
100%. 100%. Yeah. I mean, I don't think there's any other thing that you recognize more, which makes sense because we are We are spirit and body. These things are not separated. Yeah, one leads to the other, and you just find like all things go together, and that's that'll lead towards when we talk about memento. The idea is, if you're going to do something, like, don't just pick one thing. I think you just need to pick a lot of things, and you have to three-dimensionally surround yourself with good practices. And that's when we separate fully spiritual practices and physical practices, we're kind of lying to ourselves. We're almost becoming Gnostic. Like, we're almost saying, like, well, I can be a spirit but not a body, or I can be a body and not a spirit. And it's good to bring these things back together. Like, if I'm gluttonous throughout my week, I'm going to be kind of lying to myself about how spiritually active am I? And anytime I reflect, I just see that's the case. Like, if I'm lazy, if I'm staying up late, if I'm scrolling on my phone, if I'm not eating well, if I don't work, if I'm not doing any of those things, I can guarantee you I'm probably not reading my Bible all that much either.
Yeah.
There's a reason that Luther said, like, hey, pastors, you probably should fast before you give a sermon on Sunday. And I'm not saying I always do that, but I can understand that sentiment. Like, if I'm up eating potato chips till midnight and then I go to preach on Sunday, like, I'm not going to be in a proper space. I mean, there's one good example is Mel Gibson, who was interviewed on Joe Rogan, and he's doing this new, he did, of course, did The Passion of the Christ, and now he's going to do this resurrection themed movie. It sounds like it's going to be a pretty big undertaking. And one of the things he said really stood out. Joe was kind of asking him on the timeline, and he's like, well, when it comes time for production, like, it's going to take probably 6 months for me to get in a right headspace. He's like, I'm going to have to do a lot of fasting and all of this. And I thought that was just brilliant, where he's like, even before I can begin production, like, I have to fully, like, train and orient my body and my mind to be able to do this thing. And I thought that was just a really good insight.
That's cool. Yeah, and I think a lot of churches, like, their desire is, they want great disciples, men and women, but few lack kind of a clear pathway to build them. And so what would you suggest for those churches that are trying to kind of define it and help them understand a little bit more of how do you turn all the people that are coming into our churches from just attendees or believers to disciples, to actual followers of Jesus? I've been on record to say I think it is the problem with the church is we've created believers but not followers. And so I'd love to hear kind of your answer to that.
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, and one thing I think is I do think community is important. I know you're big on that. I think that's big, and it kind of depends. Well, it doesn't always depend, but especially both you and I are at bigger churches. The reality is you can have someone come in for 4 Sundays, attend for 4 Sundays, and there's a chance nobody connects with them, and you might not even see them as a pastor. When you have a lot of people there on a Sunday, and then they might leave. Right, or they might attend for 6 months and not get plugged in, and other people, everyone's got their circles or whatnot. So that's certainly important. That's just kind of humanity one-on-one, right? Like we get plugged into things, and then we stay into those that we have relationships with. So that's one. I mean, back to the habits. I certainly think that's another. And I think maybe having a vehicle for people to feel comfortable asking questions. Because I think I'm always surprised at how many questions people have. If you give someone an opportunity to sit there with questions, they'll say like they're 1 or 2. And they'll be like, well, I don't know if I have any others. Then if you kind of like let it sit there for another 60 seconds, then they'll just be like, well, actually, and then you find out there's like 5 or 6 more questions. So people really do. I mean, people are coming, they're engaging all sorts of media. So they're coming up, they're reading weird things or good things about history, cultural ideas, family type ideas about religions and stuff that our sermon on Sunday is not necessarily going to deconstruct those narratives. So having some kind of opportunity where people can genuinely ask questions, and how you create that structure, there's different ways to do it. But I think just at least starting with being aware of your people, even your dedicated people, they have some questions and they've got some narratives that are intertwined into their mind that might be anti-Christian, and there needs to be some kind of way for them to address those, to ask questions, to feel comfortable doing so, like maybe to think about it in that way.
That's cool. And from the early part of what I know about what you've created, Memento, it feels like there's a place for community habits and questions, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, and maybe some other things. So give us the origin story behind Memento and where it came from.
Yeah, so Memento comes from, well, the word means remembrance, right, in Latin, and a lot of reasons for that. One of the keystones are the backbone is the season of Lent. We're going to have programs throughout the year with reading plans and different disciplines and such, but the heaviest is going to be Lent, because Lent is the one that leans into, as far as the church goes, like that is the season for fasting and the most type of discipline. And of course, we begin on Ash Wednesday, with Memento Mori, or remember, O man, from thou art dust, and to dust thou shalt return. So that's certainly one aspect. The other aspect is that we're trying to bring back things that we have forgotten, as not just the church. I'm not just saying the Lutheran church, but really just the modern church in general has forgotten things that were staples and sometimes even like necessities for the Christian life. We had Ian Kinney on. He's probably the best intellectual expert on this. He spent a long time studying this. He knows, the history of this really well. And one of his phrases is, he goes, listen, if you do like Memento and you do tier 3, so we've got 3 tiers. And for most people, you'll start with tier 1, and maybe you'll start to dabble up into tier 2, tier 3 things. It's like, if you do tier 3, you're probably fasting less hard than a medieval grandmother did, and it's just, so it's very humbling there. And not to say that that's the only thing within Christianity, but it is something that we've forgotten. So then, if I go to this personally, I got plugged into, a program like this 4 years ago in 2022, and a friend kind of talked me into it, and I was like, all right, fine, I'll do it, but I don't want to do this, this, and this. And eventually it was like, you got to do this, this, and this, like, man up, right? So I was like, okay, fine. So I was kind of reluctant and did this. It was challenging. Some things were less challenging than I thought. Some things were more challenging than I thought. And I very quickly realized that this is the most beneficial and impactful thing I've done in my Christian life. And I'm not taking away from like going to church or receiving the sacrament, but just tangibly speaking, it changed things. It exposed things I didn't even know were issues. It was absolutely transformative. So I've been off and on doing things like this in the last 4 years, and I just can't endorse it enough. So we didn't have anything like this within the Lutheran church. So the idea was, okay, we need to have this here in the Lutheran church. So that was part of it. It was experiential, but then the more I looked at it experientially, I realized, no, these are things that were staples. Like, these are things that men before us did with regularity, sometimes by necessity, and then sometimes just, normalcy in the church. I mean, some of these things that are built in are things that just people 50, 75 years ago didn't even have to worry about, because they did physical labor. They weren't sitting like I am right now and throughout the day. They didn't have screens in front of them all the time. So some of this is just dealing with, just bringing back to what a human did 50, 70 years ago and remember what that was like. But then there's other things like actual food fasting, where you're like, oh yeah, Jesus says, like, when you fast, don't do it as the Pharisees. He doesn't say fasting is what Pharisees do. He says, when you fast, I'm going to assume that you're fasting, because the Jews have always fasted. And the early Christians continued to fast, like they thought that was really important. And then you actually do a food fast, and you're like, oh my goodness, I understand why this is so important. Like, once you get past, oh man, it's been 4 hours, like, how am I going to survive? Once you get past that,
my least favorite of the spiritual disciplines.
It was food. That's what brutalized me the first time. I had no idea that was an addiction of mine. And yeah, now I usually do 1 meal a day. I mean, it's amazing how, God carries you along these things. But I could go into the benefits of it, but it's just, I mean, at the macro standpoint, I can just say these things have been transformative. And and then built into this is speaking specifically to the masculine spirit. And that's not to diminish, of course, the female side. We do hope to launch one for women that'll be different on purpose in the fall, and we're working with some different ladies on that and trying to figure out what does this look like, because it's not, historically speaking, these mandates, that are the mandates and advice, depending on where you go in church history, for these different types of things. They were geared differently towards men and women, so we don't want to directly replicate that. But you got to start with one, and so we said, I know what it looks like on the masculine side. Yeah. Not the feminine side so much. We've got some other ladies trying to help build that, but yeah.
That's cool. So when you say I did this 4 years ago and this is what Memento is, I heard, things like there's going to be disciplines, and one of those is fasting, and it was challenging, that there's some sort of challenge aspect to it potentially. So yeah, what does it kind of look like from a day to day, if that makes sense, to be involved with Memento?
Yeah, let's see. I don't have the document in front of me, so let's see how good my memory here. So let's, if you go through time periods, we're getting close to Christmas here. So, in fact, at the tail end of Advent. So devotions begin January 1st, but the Lenten program begins February 1st. So let's just jump forward to February 1st, what that looks like. Okay. So the way your day would be structured on a tier 1, it would say, hey, we want to begin and end your day with a prayer. We want to keep it simple, and we want to give you some structure here, right? So people might know like something like a matins or a vespers, and you can go to the hymnal and look at a formal service that's a little bit longer. We've got someone, Daniel brought us, that's gone back and said, okay, if we go back to the Didache, to the earliest church, what did they kind of put out as a simple prayer for the morning? And it's mostly integrating psalms, having a benediction, things like that. So we said, okay, we don't want to throw people into 10 minutes of prayer in the morning and evening, because that might be a lot. So we've got a 2 to 3 minute service that's historically rooted to say, hey, this is what from the early church, they said these are kind of the base minimums that you do to begin and end your day. So that's one. Within there, we have a reading plan. Lent is going to be the heaviest. This year, we're saying, hey, let's read through the New Testament. So we have a reading plan that brings you through the New Testament. And then we have a daily devotion, which is probably about a 4 to 5 minute read, right? So that's going to be your backbone there. And then some of the other things that are included are, well, what's going to get in the way for that in the morning? Well, probably that snooze button that we all hit, right? Which is a good way to say, I'm going to start 0-3 for the day. Like, I set my alarm for 6 a.m. because I knew there were things that I wanted to do, but you know what? Actually, I'm going to crawl out of bed at 6:30 after 3 times in a row I said, I'm going to choose comfort over commitment, right? So let's cut that out. Let's say commit to a waking time and stick with it for these 63 days. Let's build a good habit. Because if you wake up when you're supposed to, you'll be able to spend the 5 to 10 minutes doing the prayer and the devotion and your readings and get all of that done. You'll be good to go, right? So that's one. Then there's the food fast, right? So for tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, this one definitely stays there but increases. So the first food fast is saying, hey, let's just cut out snacks and sweets and alcohol for 63 days. Because alcohol is a sin? No, because alcohol is a great thing. But let's take a time period to step away from that so you can appreciate it more when Easter season comes, right? And to see what it's like to go without for 63 days. So cut those things out and then just eat your 3 meals, right? Learn what it's like to say, man, I had lunch at 12 and dinner's at 5:30 and I'm a little bit hungry at 4. Like, just lean into that hunger and see what that's like and overcome that. And realize that maybe that hunger can be driven towards other things even and higher things. And then on Wednesdays and Fridays, which historically speaking, Wednesdays and Fridays were the days where you would do more severe fasting, because Wednesday was the betrayal of Jesus, where Judas goes to the leaders and, with the 40 pieces of silver betrays Jesus. So we're remembering things in our life where we also betray Jesus. And then Friday, of course, is the crucifixion. So Wednesdays and Fridays a little bit more severe. So now you're going to do 2 meals, Skip breakfast at the beginning. Maybe you do an early lunch at 11, and it'll be a little bit of a struggle, but give it a week or two and you'll be okay. Then in that tier 1, what else? Probably the other big one is we need to limit technology. So we need to use technology. You need it for phones. You should still listen to the Red Letter Challenge, or Red Letter Disciple. You should still listen to the podcast. That's good. Let's not scroll. Let's not use it as something that pulls us away from our family in the evening. So only what's necessary and beneficial. So maybe in the evening at 5 o'clock, when you get home, you put your phone in the drawer and you say, I'm done. I'm going to be present with the family. Like, you're fasting from technology. That means TV too. Now, we've got some guidelines in there of exceptions or maybe easing in for the first couple weeks, especially if you have older kids that are used to watching TV with you. But yeah, maybe at least from Ash Wednesday on, say no TV, we're going to do board games. We're going to have longer conversations at dinner. The phone's going to be away. Like, let's just restore this peace in the household. And then the other thing is only listening to uplifting music. And that's one I can speak to and say, I thought that was kind of dumb the first time I did it. I was like, I want to listen to my rock music when I work out. And when I went back afterwards and I said, great, now I can go listen to, I won't even say the names of the bands I would listen to when I would work out. I went back to them and I felt sick to my stomach. And I realized how desensitized I had been by not just music, also TV. But when I went through just that fast from both TV and music, from those 6, I've never gone back to that type of music. And I'm not saying I don't ever listen to rock. I do. I still like Tool and I'll listen to them here or there. But it's my palate has changed. And I cannot even watch the movies that I used to watch. And I was not I didn't watch horror movies or anything like that, but just, you don't realize how desensitized you are. So that's tier 1. There's some more upgrades for tier 2 and tier 3 that intensify and then introduce some other things. Probably the only other one, I could say some of the others, but the one worth mentioning is cold showers.
Wow.
Which we don't introduce to tier 2, so that you can do this and never do a cold shower, and that's okay. But that was one of the ones early on when I said I'm not doing cold showers, and my buddies, they're like, you got to do it. And I'm like, all right, fine, I'll do it. And I hated it for like a week, and since then I've loved it. It is one of the best little just tricks. There's nothing in the Bible that tells you go take a cold shower. Although up until just very recently, no one was taking hot showers because we didn't have hot water, right? So this is one of those things, you're just connecting with things that your ancestors did on a normal basis and didn't think twice. What a cold shower does, there's a bunch of health benefits, but the biggest thing is, we don't face a lot of discomfort. Usually my car is heated before I even get into it. We're so soft on in that. The cold shower is 60 seconds of very reasonable pain and discomfort, and it's you telling yourself, perhaps early in the morning, I'm going to do this hard thing. And once you do that, then you come back out, you feel really good, and you say, I did that hard thing, I can go do other hard things. And then something like sitting down and reading the Bible is not so hard because, I just did like my hardest thing. So yeah, point being, there's some other disciplines in tier 2 and tier 3, but the goal is to speak to that masculine spirit and say, let's discipline body and mind, and let's discipline your time and your attention, and let's deal with things like sloth and gluttony that have much more of a hold on you than you think. That was my recognition as I went through these. And you'll find that it pulls out weeds in your life and allows God to plant a lot of good fruit, and provide some clarity. Sometimes I think we just go through life and things seem off, we're frustrated with different things, we can't get to the root of it. And I think doing things like this exposes the root. I didn't know what the root of a lot of my problems were, and they were exposed, and I'm not going to say they're 100% gone, but I saw God working in those areas, and at the very least, I knew how to detect those when they started to come back. I was like, oh, I know what that is.
Yeah, you mentioned sloth and gluttony. How much of and I think of greed too. I preached on it not long ago of it was a really law-heavy sermon. And I did that intentionally, and I even told the church, I'm gonna make you sit in this for a while today, and you're gonna feel uncomfortable. And just at the moment where you feel like you can't bear it any longer, I'm gonna bring the good news. But I want to do it because I just don't think you think you're greedy, and I think I'm greedy, and yet I think we're all greedy. And I think it's one of those sins, and you mentioned sloth and gluttony, they're all kind of part of that, right? That 7 deadly sins that the early church fathers have brought about. How much of, has there been a lot of looking into those 7 deadly sins, or a part of that this is really kind of recognizing the early church saw these things as deadly, but it doesn't feel like we're treating them with the same severity that we need to? Does that make sense?
100%, yeah.
Yeah.
And by the way, we didn't plan this, but 7 Deadly Sins is in January. That's going to be the first 2 weeks, is dealing with the 7 Deadly Sins and the 7 theological virtues. And I've studied the 7 Deadly Sins a lot. I've presented on it a couple times, and I'm fascinated by it. And I like the term 7 Deadly Sins because all of this is deadly. Sometimes it's called capital sins too, meaning these are kind of internal. These are internal things that lead to physical sins, right? So, you think of the 5th commandment, thou shalt not murder. One of the things the 7 deadly sins are going to teach you is that before Cain, for instance, commits murder, first he commits envy, and then he commits wrath. That these are capital sins that lead to a manifestation of a physical sin that you can see. Now, the tricky thing about the 7 deadly sins is they're not always detectable. The last of the 7 deadly sins is lust, and that's probably the one that most people detect. And I've had many people that come to me and say, hey, I struggle with lust. I've never had anyone come to me and say, I struggle with pride. I've never had anyone say I struggle with envy. Never had anyone say that I struggle with sloth. Gluttony, maybe one, So as you get to the more severe ones, which are at the beginning with pride, envy, I think wrath is number 3.
Greed is in there, right?
Yeah, avarice, greed. I've never had anyone say that I struggle with greed, right? These are undetectable, or they're not really undetectable, they're more difficult to detect. And that's where I think it takes a lot of work to try to get to those roots. You can say, I'm yelling at my wife. or something like that. That might be someone that someone recognizes, and I don't know if that's good. But there's something deeper down that's leading to that. And it might be pride, it might be a self-obsession, it could be envy, it could be different things that are leading towards this. And I think it takes a lot of work to get to that. And that's where I think some of these disciplines kind of, they push into that. You're like, man, I am really gluttonous. Like, I can't go 4 hours without food. Like, how wild is that for our ancestors that normally ate 1, maybe 2 meals a day?
Yeah, that's good. And I think with this, it's a really cool opportunity to challenge yourself, and that's kind of a big proponent of mine. Is that I think people are ready for. They're ready for a challenge. They're ready to kind of admit, I'm not okay with the status quo. And sometimes we need something and someone from the outside to just tell us, all right, do this. And I've found, that to be true with my 40-day challenges, that people just need someone else to ask. And if they have somebody else that they're accountable to or an ally in it, and I've seen this in my own life too, like, we're just much more likely to get those things done. And so talk to me. So it sounds like I have a pretty good understanding of, like, we're going to be doing some spiritual but challenging, hard things for the sake of being the man of God He's called us to be. Some of those are going to be harder than others for each one of us because we're wired a little differently, but it'll be challenging. And is there a community aspect to it? Because I've found in my own discipleship efforts, like, if someone else is walking alongside of me, even with physical working out, like, I'm much more liable to go meet you at the gym if I know you're going to be there. Whereas if I'm just doing it with myself, I'm like, well, I don't know. Do I need to go today? So yeah, what about the accountability, ally, kind of brotherhood side of things?
Yeah, that's an intricate part of this.
Okay.
Technically speaking, someone could sign up and go through the devotions and try to do something themselves. We don't recommend that in the slightest. And in fact, I tried at one point to do that on my own, and all my disciplines failed. And this was like my 3rd year of doing this. So this wasn't even my first try, and everything just fizzled out. So the way we have it structured, we call them fraternities or brotherhoods. And so the goal is for you to create your fraternity, whether it's, within your church, or if you've got buddies. The first year I did it with some buddies in Indiana and Minnesota, and we met remotely. Church is probably one of the best ways, because then it can feed into the church life, and, men can bond together and build some good bonds. And we recommend 4 to 8. Even if you get to 8, I would say it's probably better to break into 2 fraternities at that point, and you can have crossover and get together or whatnot. But the way the meetings are structured, we'd say once a week we give you meeting structures. They're pretty simple in that you're opening with prayer, going through any announcements, reflecting on the theme from the previous week, and then everyone gets a chance to reflect on the week. And it's a really valuable time where you just kind of say, yeah, I was struggling with this. This is more difficult than I thought. And then you find somebody else that says, yeah, I was struggling with that too. And then you guys kind of work through it together. I remember our first year, it was like the first 2 weeks, everyone's like, man, we're really tired. I'm going to bed at like 9 o'clock. Like, why am I so tired? And my one buddy, his wife's a doctor, and she's like, yeah, you guys, like, you're rewiring your mind. Like, you guys have a bunch of addictions you're trying to deal with, and, like, food addictions and stuff. Like, your mind's being rewired, so you're tired. But so you kind of get answers to the things that are going on. And then beyond that, we have one more personal checkpoint. So if let's say you got 6 guys, you want 3 groups of 2 within that. And then on a daily basis, could be a phone call, could be just a simple text, you check in with that person. I advocate for gearing that around the morning wake up, and, like, you wake up and you say up, when you get into the bathroom. So that way there's that accountability when, like, you want to hit the snooze of, if I don't text Matt here in the next 5 minutes, he's going to know that I'm snoozing. And here's a little bit of good shame, that's going to get me out of bed. And then, I'll reflect on the day previously. Something like that. And that helps keep that accountability. It helps build a good brotherhood. There's guys that I've never met in person. Rory Babbitt is one of the guys' names. He lives in Indiana. And I feel like he's a close personal friend, and I've never met him in person. We did 2 years of this together, not even for the whole year, just 2 different times, like around Lent. And it was just, you get to know them so well, because you're talking about struggles, you're talking about victories, you're doing hard things together. So that fraternity and brotherhood aspect is very important, and it really does build strong bonds.
That's cool. It's Memento 70. What's the 70? I heard 63 earlier, kind of that's starting, if you start at February 1 to get to Easter this year, or yeah. Tell me more about that.
Yeah, so so February 1st is Septuagesima, which is kind of like a pre-Lent. So, we know of like Ash Wednesdays when
Right.
Lent begins, but there's a pre-Lent, and it's designed to be a little less intense, but to kind of start warming you up, and then you get to Fat Tuesday and have your last hurrah, and then you go to Ash
Yeah.
Wednesday. Which, by the way, there will be feast days built in. So we'll say it's Fat Tuesday, like, I don't know, get some ice cream out, get together, have a beer, whatever. Like, we'll have some of that built into it as well. So it's really 63 days. Just marketing wise, it sounds dumb to say like Memento 63. So we called it Memento 70. It's as close as we can get. And the idea is that we include like those first 7 days of Easter to kind of say, I mean, really, we're just kind of justifying, because we'll have our own Easter season with its own things, which are not disciplines, by the way. Easter's just feast, and just learn how to feast now in a healthy way now that you're coming out of the fast. But yeah, so we say, well, you got to bridge into Easter to justify the 70.
But now we got 6-7, so it could have been Memento 67, which is a little closer to 60.
Could have been 67, yeah.
Missed opportunity there. There's competitor that can jump on that. But so what happens? So what's the goal? Is the goal to get as many men as possible? If there's a pastor or church leader out there, is this like, hey, you should do this with the people in your church? Should a father do this with his son? Tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, there's a lot of good questions there. I don't, a couple specifics. I don't recommend a father and son doing it together, although they can. You can make it work, and it's going to be better than not. But ideally, you'd want two different groups so that the father can be more open and the son can be more open within that group of, if they're struggling with things, that's a good place to talk about. If someone's struggling with like, anything serious like pornography or anything like that. And so it's good. I also recommend that to pastors. Like, if you're going to do this in your church, like, get some fraternities going, check in with the group leaders, but find your own group too. Just so you can be more open. Can you make it work if you're within your church fraternity? Absolutely. But sometimes it's a little more comfortable in those ways. We do have a goal, and the goal is 5,000 men. So far we've been doing pretty good on our fraternities, launching kind of throughout the U.S. and the world. And what's the reason for that? Maybe here's where I can speak about another aspect, and this ties back to what we were talking about earlier. One of the questions we get, which is a good question, is, hey, why does this cost money? Which is a good question. And probably the best way to think of it is there's different ways that you can do any kind of business. If you go to the gym world, there's Planet Fitnesses, there's YMCAs. If you're in my area, there's Lifetime Fitness, right? There are different business models. And, the idea is we could put a Google Doc together with things, and we could just say, anyone that's interested, we're going to send this out to you. We probably couldn't do the 365 devotions because that's, I don't want to, that's a lot of work, and you should pay people for that, which we are. But we could do this kind of super lean and try to make it free. Why did we not do that? Well, that goes back to our original notions. It's the same reason with On the Line why we've got, expensive camera equipment and why we have a full-time producer. We want to put high quality things that can bring Lutheran voice out to the macro world. So to do that with Memento takes a lot of work and a lot of resources to build high-end websites, to build a high-end app. If we want to be able to try to push, how many Lutheran churches, and I'm not scolding them for this, but how many Lutheran churches use Right Now Media? And I would estimate around 20 to 33% at least. Those aren't Lutheran resources, but they're really good resources. They're well-produced videos. They're better than what the Lutheran Institute of Theology puts out. I'll tell you that. As far as quality goes.
And we love Right Now Media, by the way. We're a partner of theirs. We've got, I think, 6 studies on there, and I think we're going to do 2 more next year with them. We're hoping to hear back.
You guys are okay
this month. So yeah.
And that's an example. What you're doing is to bring Lutheran resources and reverse that trend. We use a lot of non-Lutheran resources, and some of it's by necessity. We want to have resources that other church bodies can use so that, Lutheran theology gets out and puts us on the map and lets people know, like, well, I do know the Lutheran church. My buddy is 23 and he's interested in church. He knows about the Lutheran church because he did Memento, right? So what does it take to build that? It takes a proper business plan, and it's not cheap, and it costs money and investment. So that's why it costs money to do these things.
And to your point, those videos on Right Now Media, we might do a 6-part video series, and I will tell you the cost to produce them is, and this is just hard cost, not even,
digital marketing
is a 5-figure cost. And so to get 6 videos. And so To your point, you don't have to sell me on that. I don't think anyone else. There are a lot that don't understand to produce high quality content. Like, it does cost, and so I also think there's something to it with, especially with something like this, that you want to put a little bit of a price tag on it to create some sort of buy-in from folks. And so I think that's really important to do that for something like this. It creates greater accountability. And I think that's a piece of this. When it's a challenge, we want to create a few things. We want to create, how do we get accountability around us, a really great program, and at the same time, a little bit of skin in the game, because all these things are greater opportunities for that person to actually go through with it. And the win is if they go through with it, because then we're going to see some life change. And you talked earlier, Bryan, about how you've had some life change. And so what do you anticipate? Let's say we hit our goal. You hit your goal. 5,000 men go through this. Like, what are the stories? What are the things that we're going to see out of the men that complete not just the 70 days or the 63 days, but the whole gamut, which there's going to be stuff outside of Lent as well.
Yeah. Yeah, and right before I jump into that, thank you for that last point. I think that's a really good point too. To where I was at the St. Louis Sem and someone was asking about that. I said, listen, if someone gave me like a $2 million donation and said, we love Memento, here's $2 million, we want you to scale and do all this stuff, I was like, I would still charge money. Like, I might make it a little bit cheaper, but I would still charge, because the studies are overwhelming on this. Like, yeah. I used to work at Lifetime Fitness, and they're more expensive, and 70% of their members use the gym on a weekly basis. I think the number was like twice on a weekly basis or 3 times. Planet Fitness, it's 7%. So the more the buy-in, the more people are going to use this. And if we just put a free PDF out there, I don't know, maybe 70 people in the U.S. are going to stick through it for 180 days and do different things. But if you buy in, you make that commitment. Yeah, so I think that's an important point too. Yeah, what would we see if we get 5,000 men, or even if we got 3,000 men? I can speak for one of the groups that I was in. Maybe I put it this way. So when I first started doing this was before On the Line ever became a thing. And I was reflecting on this, and I don't think if I had started doing these disciplines, I don't think if I had not done those, I don't think On the Line would be here. I don't think Lit would be here. I don't think Memento would be here, because it recalibrated a lot of habits in my life. And going in, I wasn't like waving the red flag, like, I've got some serious issues. I can tell that my life's falling apart. It was nothing like that. But I didn't even realize all these different barriers that I had. And after 2 years of doing this, I think On the Line in many ways came out of that. I think God worked through that to help prepare for On the Line. I could put it that way. Just in my group, I had another guy who he goes in and he's like, well, I'm playing video games. I'm playing Rocket League at night, and I'm having a couple beers. Like, maybe it'd be best to like move away from that nightly habit. And so that was his goal. And I think about 6 months later, he turned his evenings into a time where he started a company. And now Tot Chop is the name of it. It's a really cool company. It's for moms or for parents. It's a Ulu type cutting board you can do with one hand. But now it's moving in the disability space, and it's becoming one of the best knives for people who have or are blind. It's really good for preventing people from cutting themselves. We saw that kind of fruits just out of our one group, our one fraternity, where tons of opportunities opened up after we were able to address some of these issues. So yeah, I imagine if you have 3,000 to 5,000 men, let's just say in the Lutheran Church, I think that you're going to have stronger marriages. I think you're going to have better parenting. I think you're going to have people that build these habits, just even beginning in these first 63 days, let alone carrying it throughout the year, that get them more involved in church. They will realize they've got more time than they thought they had, that a lot of time is being wasted, and good things will take the place. I think you'll see strength in those ways. And that's where, there's examples in the Old Testament where, God's like going to bring destruction on Israel, and they call for a fast, right? And all the people fast, and God's judgment relents, And I'm not trying to make the overt claim like, Memento's going to stop. I'm not directly attaching that, but we do see biblical examples to where if you can get a lot of people doing this, it's going to have a good ripple effect. And there's tangible things I can speak to. You will have more time. You will have more self-control. You'll get into a better habit of reading the Bible and spending time with your family. Those things are very tangible. There's also then the ripple effect of spiritual things that we don't quite understand, right? I know you've got like this prayer thing coming up in January that we're going to be doing together. And it's like, I can't say, well, I'm going to do that and then I'm going to go home and my wife's going to love me more, But I do know that when we submit these things up to God and when we orient our lives, there's the whole unknown that takes place where God blesses us as we turn to Him.
Yeah, that's good, man. What discipline would you say has shaped you the most?
That's a good question. It would probably be, well, I spoke about the music one. I realized how desensitized I've been. That's shifted. I listen to much more uplifting music, and I recognize that has a different effect on my day. So that's been pretty effective. The food fasting has been, I think, in a big way. It's in many ways freed up my day, where I'm not always worried about my next meal 2 hours later. I'm just, so that's been helpful. Especially an extended fast that I do during Holy Week is probably one of the best spiritual experiences I have throughout the year. That is tremendous, but you do have to build up to that.
That's cool.
And then cold showers have been very beneficial. I do cold plunges now, and it's
Nice. You're one of those guys, yeah.
Oh, it's really it's a beautiful thing, but it's also a little trick to where, if I've fallen into sloth or gluttony and I'm feeling kind of weak and lazy in the morning, sometimes I'll be like, all right, just go take a cold shower, and it's like a good 60-second fix, and it reverses that pretty quickly.
That's cool. All right, so this sounds great, man. Where do people go to get plugged in? I know this is airing or going live, I should say, before Christmas, a few days, and so we're not quite to 2026 yet, but we're almost there. And I've found that the beginning of the year is one of the best times for you or for the people in your church, if you're a pastor, for people to put new rhythms into place. And so, where can people go to kind of find out more about Memento and sign up? And tell me about that.
Yeah, so it's Memento, MEMENTO 70.com. And if one of the other things too is if you can't find a fraternity, if you're saying I just don't have buddies in my area, I don't think there's any men in my church that are going to do it. We do have we're plugging people into fraternities, so we can help find one for you. No one's going to be left alone on that. So you can reach out to us for that at contact@memento70.com, and that's on the website as well. So we can support you in that way as well. So yeah, we've got videos, we've got a lot of good resources on there, and then once you sign up on the back end, you'll find big documents that go through like the overview. It gives you kind of the why, what, how for all of the disciplines. Talks about like exceptions and things like that. We've got a fraternity structure that tells you everything you need to know about how to structure your fraternity and what to expect. And really, one thing that's worth mentioning is the fraternity is the checkpoint. Like if you feel like you have an exception or you want to change something on the disciplines, like you don't reach out to Bryan Stecker. You just talk to your fraternity and like talk with them about it and say, hey, whatever, my anniversary's coming up. Should I go get a glass of wine? And the answer should be yes, go get a glass of wine. Like that's okay. That trumps, the fast for that evening. So the fraternity guide, and then we also have one for spouses or roommates. So something to go through with them so they understand that. Like we don't want a wife to be caught off guard where you're like, well, I'm not supposed to eat meat on Friday. Why'd you make spaghetti? Well, in the guide, we're like, never scold your wife. Don't use this as an excuse for that one, but talk about beforehand so she knows what to expect, and invite her into different things, and plan together on what it looks like to do board games with the kids on a Thursday instead of watching whatever it is you watch on TV. So we've got those things there, and then as this airs, we've got so as a thank you for those that are signing up, because January 1st is when like the formal devotions start. And to build an app and do things like that, obviously we need like early adopters to kind of figure out how we can scale and how quickly we can build new enhancements. So as a thank you, we've got a founder special. So that's 33% off. So it's basically $5 a month. And the big key there is those that sign up on the founder special, we're locking them in for life. So they are always at that cost. That does not go up, indefinitely. So that's what we've got going on from there. We're going to try to work depending on different things to, keep cost as affordable as possible while always keeping some cost. But that's what we have going on right now.
So $5 a month, $60 a year, Founders Special. Get in now today before that goes up, which still is a reasonable price after that, and for what they're getting. And so I think it's awesome, man. I my heart is like, how do we form more disciples? And we need anything and everything. We need new tools, new programs, new ideas. We need challenges. We need things that are fun and exciting that we can do together. And I think you've created a really beautiful thing here, specifically for the Lutherans. And I know there's a large team of people behind you on this. Is that correct?
Yeah, we've got, I think, about 14 contributors
Great.
working in different ways. Many of them are devotion writers. In the future, we've got all 14 working, or I think maybe 12 are writing devotions. Some others are helping with different areas of support. And then in the future, we'll have like 2 or 3 work on a specific program or season, which each one will have its different focus, lighter disciplines every season outside of Lent, but some disciplines outside of Easter.
Yeah, that's great, bro. Cool, man. Well, hey, we ask everybody if you can challenge all of our listeners to do one thing today to be a greater disciple of Jesus. What would that be? Outside of like go to Memento and sign up.
Yeah.
That's a good one too. But what would that be?
Yeah, I won't say cold showers. Yeah, so avoiding any of the Memento things. What would be something else that would be really good? Well, if you're listening here like right before Christmas, I would say try to memorize a verse or 2 from Savior of the Nations Come. I think that's, not by human flesh or blood, by the Spirit of our God was the Word of God made flesh, woman's offspring pure and fresh. That one is a very old hymn, and it's just it gives you our theology on the incarnation. What I said there was a whole verse, right? So they're very simple. But that's a little cool thing, because if you can expand that into memorizing hymns or other Christian songs, or I memorize Tolkien poetry too, it's really cool because you can sing it at any point. You can sing it to your kids if you put it to music. Yeah, I think that's a fun little practice.
There you go. And that's why not. We're right before Christmas. Let's celebrate. Let's get in those hymns and those beautiful, beautiful words that describe the incarnation and the wonderful part of this season. So, hey, thanks, Bryan. Thanks so much for taking the lead on this and for your heart and doing what you are to make Lutheran theology accessible and get it out to a lot more people in a lot of different ways. That fruit is pretty awesome to see this coming to fruition. So appreciate you. And if people want to connect with you, where can they find you?
Yes, handful of places. Probably the On the Line website's probably the most forward, that has my contact information. ontheline.net. Bryan.Stecker at Trinity Waconia. Well, there's a couple. I've got too many emails. Best email, Bryan.Stecker at ontheline.net.
There you go.
That's probably the best email.
Perfect, man. Well, thanks, and I wish you all the success in Memento, and excited to kind of be on that journey with you and see what the Lord does with this awesome program.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
You bet, bud.
Well, I hope you enjoyed today's episode with Bryan Stecker. He's doing amazing things online to help disciple, and specifically disciple men. And so, hey, if you want to get in on that founder's price, you can go to memento70.com. Not a lot of time left to do it, so do it today before you forget, before the new year, and go to redletterpodcast.com for that link and others. If you enjoyed today's podcast or our podcast, please would you give us a 5-star review on Apple or Spotify, or if you're on YouTube, please subscribe and feel free to put anything in the comments that you feel like would be helpful for us as we navigate what it looks like being greater disciples, specifically in 2026 in our Lutheran Church Missouri Synod. Thank you so much for listening. Have a great week and have a great Christmas Eve and Christmas celebration. What a beautiful season it is, and to God be the glory. We'll see you back next week for another episode of Red Letter Disciple.